This story is titled, I Never Thought I'd See My Ex-Husband Again. Then we met at a Christmas party, and now he wants a second chance. After years apart, I'm torn between revisiting the past or leaving it behind for good, and I can't decide if old feelings are worth the risk. If someone had told me a year ago that my life, the future I had so carefully built, the love I had so fiercely believed in, would collapse in an instant, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. I would have brushed it off as one of those exaggerated cautionary tales people share over drinks, the kind meant to make you appreciate what you have. But as I sit here now, forced to sift through the ruins of what once felt like a fairy tale, I realize that sometimes life doesn't warn you before it rips the ground out from under you. I met James 5 years ago, back when I had just moved to Boston for my dream job in marketing at a thriving tech company. Fresh out of college, wide-eyed and eager, I was ready to carve out my place in the world, unaware that fate had already woven James into the fabric of my future. He worked in product development, confident, sharp, and effortlessly charismatic in a way that made people naturally gravitate toward him. At first, he was just a coworker, a familiar face during morning coffee runs and lunch breaks in the sunlit company courtyard. But as the months passed, our conversations stretched longer, laughter became easier, and one afternoon, as he leaned against my cubicle with that knowing smirk of his, he asked me out. At first, I hesitated. Office relationships were complicated, a tangled mess of unwritten rules and whispered gossip, and I had always been careful. But James had this way of making everything feel uncomplicated, as if the risk didn't matter, as if what we had was inevitable. So I said yes. And just like that, my life took a turn I hadn't expected. What followed were 3 years of what I can only describe as pure, unfiltered happiness. James had a way of turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. Late-night takeout runs where he'd insist on ordering for me because he claimed to know my cravings better than I did. Sunday mornings spent in bed with the city humming quietly outside our window. Impromptu road trips just because the world felt too small when we stayed in one place too long. With him, life wasn't just lived, it was felt deeply and completely. But what truly made me believe in forever wasn't just James. It was the family that came with him. His parents, Tom and Sarah, welcomed me with open arms from the very beginning, as though I had always been meant to be part of their world. They had no other children, and Sarah, in particular, clung to me like the daughter she had always longed for. Their home, an old colonial estate passed down through generations, quickly became my safe haven. Sundays were spent gathered around their grand wooden dining table, sharing stories over Sarah's famous pot roast while Tom sat at the head, sipping his whiskey with a quiet kind of satisfaction. It was the kind of warmth I had always imagined a family should have. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged to something bigger than myself. When James proposed, it wasn't a grand spectacle or a meticulously planned event. It was simple, intimate, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the most significant thing in the world. We were in his parents' garden, the evening air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, the sky above us painted in soft hues of orange and pink. He pulled me close, his hands slightly trembling as he reached into his pocket, and when he slipped his grandmother's engagement ring onto my finger, I saw something in his eyes, something raw and real, something that made every doubt I had ever held about love disappear in an instant. Sarah cried, pressing my hands between hers as she whispered about how she had always known we were meant to be. Tom, ever the stoic presence, simply nodded, his approval evident in the way his usually impassive expression softened. That night, we celebrated with champagne, laughter echoing through the old house as I let myself believe, wholeheartedly, that I had found my forever. The months that followed were a blur of wedding preparations. Sarah, ever the planner, insisted on helping with every detail, from selecting the venue, a breathtaking garden estate that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a dream, to choosing the perfect floral arrangements. The guest list grew longer with each passing week, every detail meticulously curated to create the perfect day. Even James, who had always been indifferent to such things, seemed caught up in the excitement, sending me pictures of suits and ties with captions like, "Which one makes me look like a husband you won't regret?" And yet, looking back now, I can't help but wonder, was there something I missed? A moment? A sign? A fleeting hesitation in James's eyes that should have told me what was coming? Because as I stood there, dress fittings and cake tastings filling my days, I was blissfully unaware that my perfect world was nothing more than an illusion waiting to shatter. In the days leading up to the wedding, the air seemed thick with anticipation, each passing moment pulling me deeper into the reality of what was about to unfold. There were still a million little things to finalize. Last-minute confirmations with the caterer, seating arrangements that needed adjusting, vows that I kept rewriting in my head, trying to capture the depth of what I felt for James in words that never seemed quite enough. But despite the chaos, there was a quiet certainty beneath it all, a steady hum of excitement that made the long hours and sleepless nights feel more like a dream than a burden. James had been unusually attentive during those final days, more so than I had expected from a man who had always prided himself on his ability to keep things simple and stress-free. He would pull me aside during planning meetings just to wrap his arms around me, whispering reassurances against my hair, promising that no matter what, this wedding would be perfect because it was ours. And I'd believed him. How could I not? Every moment with him had been a testament to the kind of love I thought we had, one that was unwavering, solid, and incapable of breaking under the weight of doubt. The morning of the wedding arrived like a quiet promise, the sky stretching pale and cloudless above the rolling hills of the estate, as if the universe itself had conspired to give us the perfect day. I had woken up early, long before my bridesmaids arrived, standing by the window of my bridal suite, watching as the first few guests trickled onto the grounds, their laughter carrying through the open air. Everything was in place, the delicate floral arch beneath which we would exchange our vows, the soft music playing in the distance, the golden light of early afternoon bathing the world in warmth. And yet beneath the exhilaration, there was something else, something so faint it barely registered at first, a feeling that slithered beneath my skin just out of reach, like an unfinished thought lingering at the edge of my consciousness. I had brushed it off as nerves, convincing myself that the weight in my chest was nothing more than the natural restlessness of a bride waiting for the moment her life would change forever. It wasn't until much later, when the guests had already filled their seats, and I stood just beyond the garden's entrance, veil draped over my face, bouquet trembling slightly in my hands, that I noticed the whispers. They started as murmurs, hushed voices weaving through the crowd, hesitant and uncertain, as if the very act of speaking aloud might make the words more real. My maid of honor, sensing my unease, had tried to shield me from whatever was happening beyond the archway, squeezing my hand in reassurance, her smile forced and brittle. But the shift in the air was impossible to ignore, the kind of silence that carried the weight of something unspeakable pressing down on the gathering like an invisible storm. Then came the moment that shattered everything. One of James's groomsmen, his face pale and tight with unease, had rushed toward us, eyes darting between my bridesmaids and me, the kind of urgency in his posture that made my stomach drop before he had even spoken a word. And then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he told me that James was gone. At first, the words didn't make sense, tumbling over themselves in my mind as if they had been spoken in a language I had yet to learn. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for some ridiculous excuse, for anything that might turn this into nothing more than a misunderstanding. But then I saw it, the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes, the pity etched into the tight line of his mouth, the way my maid of honor gasped softly beside me as realization struck. James had left. He hadn't simply stepped away for a moment of quiet. He hadn't gotten caught up in a last-minute emergency or misplaced his phone in a fit of distraction. He had left me standing there, surrounded by the people who had come to witness our love, with nothing but a hurriedly scrawled note delivered by the man who had sworn to stand beside him at the altar. The note itself was a mess of half-formed apologies and vague explanations, words like "not ready," and "I need time," and "I didn't want to hurt you like this," jumping off the page with every uneven stroke of his handwriting. And just like that, the world I had spent years building collapsed beneath me. There was no dramatic outburst, no wailing sobs or frantic demands for an explanation. In the moments that followed, I felt nothing at all. Numbness wrapped around me like a second skin, shielding me from the full force of what had just happened. The guests, unsure of how to react, had shifted awkwardly in their seats, their whispers now an incessant hum, a chorus of disbelief and quiet speculation. Someone, maybe my maid of honor, maybe Sarah, had taken the note from my trembling fingers, reading it with wide, disbelieving eyes before crushing it in her palm, as if doing so could somehow erase the reality of it. And then came the realization that cut deeper than the betrayal itself. James wasn't alone. A friend, one of those well-meaning individuals who believes that truth, no matter how painful, should never be hidden, had approached me in the aftermath, face twisted with regret as they hesitated before speaking. But the moment the words left their mouth, there was no taking them back. James hadn't simply run away from the commitment, hadn't vanished into thin air out of fear or indecision. He had left with someone else. Kelly, the neighbor's daughter. The girl who had been at every Sunday dinner, who had laughed at my jokes and asked about wedding details with seemingly genuine enthusiasm, who had positioned herself so neatly into the periphery of our lives that I had never once thought to question her presence. She had been there all along, waiting, watching, and now, in a cruel twist of fate, she had taken my place beside the man I had planned to spend forever with. It was in that moment, as the weight of it all finally settled over me, that the numbness shattered, replaced by a grief so consuming it left me gasping for breath. The world blurred around the edges, voices fading into an indistinct hum as my vision tunneled, as the carefully constructed image of the life I had imagined burned to ash before my eyes. And yet, even through the devastation, even as I stood there in the ruins of everything I had once believed in, a single thought pushed its way to the surface. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Because what I didn't know in that moment, what James had failed to consider in his selfish escape, was that the story wasn't his to control. And fate, it seemed, had other plans for me. The days that followed unraveled in slow motion, each moment stretching into an eternity of whispers, sidelong glances, and a grief so sharp it left an ache in my chest that refused to fade. The world around me carried on as if nothing had changed. Cars still rushed past my apartment window. The sun still rose and set as though my pain was insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But for me, time had fractured. Every hour blurred into the next, a haze of unanswered phone calls and unopened messages, of well-meaning friends offering condolences wrapped in words that felt empty, meaningless in the face of what had been taken from me. At first, I had done what people do when their lives collapse around them. I tried to disappear into the silence, convinced that if I stayed still long enough, if I avoided the pitying eyes and the murmured reassurances that I would heal with time, maybe I could press pause on the unbearable reality of it all. But grief, I learned, is relentless. It doesn't wait patiently at the edges of your mind, allowing you the luxury of avoiding it until you're ready. It seeps into everything, creeping into the quiet moments between breaths, curling around your thoughts when you least expect it, until even the simplest actions, picking up the phone, opening the curtains, stepping outside, become insurmountable tasks. And yet, amid the chaos of my unraveling, there was one voice that refused to be drowned out, one presence that remained steady when everything else had crumbled. James's father, Tom. Unlike Sarah, who had reached out within hours of the wedding's collapse, her messages, full of apologies and sorrow and promises that she had no idea her son was capable of such cruelty, Tom had remained silent. In the beginning, I had assumed it was because he, too, had chosen to stand by James, to offer him the kind of quiet support that parents extend to their children even when they don't deserve it. But when he finally called, his voice steady, measured, carrying none of the frantic emotion I had come to expect from the conversations surrounding this disaster, I realized that his silence had not been an act of indifference, but of calculation. He had been waiting, watching, deciding what to do next. When he asked me to meet him for dinner, I almost declined, exhaustion pressing heavy against my limbs, the thought of stepping into a public space unbearable in my current state. But something in his tone, in the quiet authority he carried so effortlessly, made me hesitate, made me say yes despite the overwhelming urge to refuse. Sitting across from him in the dimly lit restaurant, I saw none of the warmth that had once colored his interactions with James, none of the quiet pride that had always softened his otherwise stern demeanor. Instead, his gaze was sharp, his expression unreadable, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of something final, something irreversible. He had always known, he admitted, that James was not the man I believed him to be. It wasn't that he had foreseen this exact betrayal, but there had been moments, small, fleeting instances over the years, where he had seen the cracks beneath the polished exterior, the selfishness hidden behind the charm. He had spent his life hoping that James would grow into the kind of man worthy of the love he had been given, but now, watching the aftermath of his son's choices, he realized that hope had been misplaced. And then, in the quiet, deliberate manner that was so distinctly Tom, he told me the part that left me breathless. James, he explained, had always assumed he would inherit everything: the house, the estate, the business ventures his father had carefully built over decades. It had all been laid out for him, an inheritance he had never questioned, never considered he might have to earn. But Tom had seen something in the past few weeks, something that had shifted everything he had once believed about legacy and family, and the weight of responsibility. He had seen how James had thrown away a future built on love and trust, how he had walked away from everything without so much as a backward glance, how he had placed his own fleeting desires above the people who had given him everything. And Tom had decided that James would receive nothing. The will had already been rewritten, the documents finalized, The signatures inked onto paper that now carried a truth that James had never once considered a possibility. Everything, the estate, the family investments, the properties that had stood as monuments to generations of hard work, would go to me. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words settled over me like a tidal wave, drowning out the clinking of silverware, the distant hum of conversation that filled the space around us. It made no sense. I had lost everything, had watched my future disintegrate in the span of a single, cruel afternoon, and yet here I was, being handed a legacy that was never meant to be mine. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him that this was madness, that I had no claim to any of it, but he held up a hand, silencing me before the words could form. This, he explained, was not about revenge. It was not about punishing James for his actions, though he would be lying if he said the thought didn't bring him a certain satisfaction. This was about something more, about ensuring that everything he had built, everything that had been passed down through his family, did not end up in the hands of a man who had proven, time and again, that he was unworthy of it. It was about doing what was right, even if it was unexpected, even if it left people questioning his decision. And so, with the stroke of a pen, my world shifted once again, not back to what it had been before, but into something entirely new, something I never could have anticipated. James, of course, was furious. When he found out, when the reality of what had been taken from him truly settled in, he called me, his voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that had been bred into him since birth. He demanded explanations, insisted that I had manipulated his father, that I had no right to any of it. He called me selfish, accused me of taking what wasn't mine, but even as the words spilled from him in a desperate attempt to regain control, I heard something else beneath them. Panic. For the first time in his life, James had lost. And as I listened to him, as I let his anger wash over me without reaction, without response, I realized something that should have been obvious from the start. This was not my loss to mourn. This was my beginning.